It started with a few cases of an unknown virus in Wuhan, China at the conclusion of 2019. Days later, the virus was identified as coronavirus, and by January 11th of this year, the first death caused by the virus was announced. Day by day, new cases of the sickness flooded in until finally it was announced by the National Institutes of Health that they were working on a vaccine. But by then, the third death caused by the virus was announced, as well as the confirmation of the first case on American soil. Of course, here in little old Aotearoa, we thought, nah, we're over 10,000 kilometers from both countries, there's no way it'll reach us. That was until the 28th of February of this year. We interrupt this broadcast with breaking news. We have confirmation of our first case of coronavirus here in New Zealand. This global crisis triggered citizens across the globe to take precautions effective immediately. Infections in over 70 countries, more than 3,100 deaths, over 90,000 global cases, just one virus. Does this pandemic sound familiar to you? Now in this case, I'm not referring to the plague epidemic, but rather racism. You see, our concerns are heightened when life is at risk, so I pose the question, why aren't we worried about the lives of victims of racism? Contrary to many opinions, racism actually does kill. Now, if we were to tackle racism the way in which we are currently tackling coronavirus, I believe we could first minimize the statistics before we are away with it. Now I hear you questioning, but Shaye, what's the cure? It starts with education and global well-being. In September last year, it was announced by Jacinda Ardern that New Zealand history is to be taught in all schools in kura by 2022. This shift was stated as a commitment to a better New Zealand that recognises the value of all of its residents. This change of curriculum is said to include a wide range of New Zealanders' experiences and is said to include the arrival of Māori to New Zealand, Titiro Waitangi, the colonisation of and immigration to New Zealand, just to name a few. First and foremost, the guarantee of all students from 2022 forward having some form of education that relates to the country in which they reside in is greatly essential to first understanding the foundations of our country, but to also be exposed to the stories of brutality endured by all of our ancestors in order for us to be here today. Now, unfortunately for some, they are still experiencing these very same trials and tribulations today. Predetermined mindsets that stem from an ongoing culture of categorizing individuals into groups, of powerful and powerless, superior and evidently inferior. Now, lucky for us, this thought process is not genetic. No, this is taught behavior. This racial stigma needs to be broken, and it starts with education on all bases. Well-being. Arguably among the top most talked about issues facing not only our communities, our country, but our world as a whole. Studies have outlined the ongoing effects racism has on well-being, with most victims of racial discrimination being more likely to have underlying health issues, including mental health, and with a lower quality of life. Psychology today even quotes that when children observe racism, it often erodes their self-confidence and mental well-being enough to affect developmental milestones and achievement in school. So the take-home message from this study is that due to racism being so embedded in our culture for centuries, it will take a conscientious effort from people across our society to remedy the problem. Now, with all that is currently happening regarding COVID-19, it's easy for us to acknowledge that from the ground up, our efforts to minimize and stop the spread of this virus have been highly commendable. However, we cannot ignore the underlying element of racism that is coming into play. A cough can be treated, but I am yet to find a vaccine for racial discrimination. Never did I ever think I would live through such a historic event in not only our nation's, but our world's history. And right now, more than ever, our well-being should be at the forefront of our concerns. Now, regardless that the virus began in China, that is no excuse for it to be identified as the Chinese virus, Mr. Trump. With headlines portraying racial discrimination towards our Asian communities appearing in local newspapers, Our Prime Minister continually urges us on the importance of being kind to one another. After all, we must unite to fight the virus, not each other. Our fears and anxieties about contracting this virus mustn't affect our outlook on others. Whilst it's important to take precautions, it does not justify the need for xenophobia. We should be focusing on enhancing and maintaining our overall well-being, uplifting, caring for those around us, remaining in contact with friends and whānau in the safest way possible, because now, of all times, is not the place for racism. As we did following the mosque attacks, and equally with the Australian bushfires, we must show our support through unity. So what's next? We must look to the past in order to face our future, right? So if we were to reflect on our own country's history, what do we know? You see, our history is laden with racial incidents against varying races, despite New Zealand being known for its diversity. The poll tax imposed on Chinese, the Tuhoi raids, the Springboks tour, the mosque attacks just last year, to name a few. Whilst we cannot change our history, we have the ability to change our future's course by what I call the 3 A's. 1. Acknowledgement. Acknowledging each other's histories, realizing that whatever our ancestors went through, bruised and battered, we are still here today, and that's got to count for something. 2. Acceptance. Accepting that this community, this country, this world we live in is far too diverse and ever-changing for us to be oppressing one another. Accepting each other's differences and putting aside whatever bad blood there is between us, because let's face it, we've got bigger issues to face together, like COVID-19, might I add. Finally, allegiance. Yes, if it wasn't already obvious, we are the cure for racism. Our country's ability to unite and abide by the rules set in place during this lockdown have already been acknowledged worldwide, with other countries wanting to follow suit. So why not give them another great example to follow than by uniting against racism for the greater good? E ai ki tēnei whakatauki. Nā tō raurau, nā taku raurau, ka ora ai te iwi.